One Question is brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996. Todd, in this series of conversations that One Question is having kind of around the state of college baseball right now, I thought it would be interesting to dig in with a head coach at a mid-major program, a place like Wofford. I want to start with this question about parity, and we've heard the word parity used quite a bit over the last couple of seasons within college baseball, and it probably stems from the likes of Stony Brook and Indiana making the College World Series a few years back, and now Coastal Carolina making it to Omaha this year. They play tonight as we record this against Texas Tech. But at the mid-major level, at a school like Wofford, how do you see parity playing across the game right now?
Well, I think our sport just lends itself to parity more so than any other. And you get a good pitching performance and a couple clutch hits, and low mid-major or low major can beat anybody. And so I think parity is kind of built into our sport overall more so than any other, which is why when you see App State beat Michigan in football, people are still talking about it almost a decade later, where if you see a school like App or like Wofford, beat a top-ranked team in baseball, people just think it's a nice headline. And so I think parity is built into our sport. However, I would say when you see people make deep runs, like Stony Brook, like Coastal, like Indiana, Stony Brook going down to LSU, winning a super regional, Coastal going to LSU, winning a super regional, it's not a coincidence. It's just not pure baseball and pure luck. I mean, those are programs that have been built from the ground up. Those are programs where people from the outside don't realize what goes into it. And while we don't play Coastal hardly ever, I mean, they're about 4 hours away from us. People think they're a lot closer, but we're not. But I've watched that program grow in the last decade, and I can go ahead and tell you that the commitment they've made to baseball, how talented their coaching staff is, what they've done, the type of players they get, how true of a niche they have and what they go after. Really, when we look at it from our coaching standpoint to somebody like Coastal, just because they're the most familiar to us, yeah, it's great to see them in Omaha, but it's not a huge surprise to us. They have been a very good team for a long time, but now people nationally are starting to see what Coastal Carolina is all about. And while parity is prevalent in our sport overall, just because of the nature of the business, you see teams like that, what Tracy did up in Indiana, building that program, building that facility, doing those things. You just can kind of see it bubbling underneath, and you just know it's a matter of time. And we played Stony Brook this year, early in the season, and it was a very close game. We were very fortunate to win late, and I turned to our coaches and I said, I'm really glad we're not playing that team in May, because you could just see the talent they had based off of that run they made, and you just knew it was going to take them a while to get going, to get some warmer weather, and to get rolling, and that's obviously what happened with them a few years ago.
Certainly one of my soapboxes about college baseball is the term Power Five. And that certainly applies mainly to the sport of football, but we hear it used across a number of other sports. And in baseball, the terminology Power Five simply does not exist. I mean, it truly is irrelevant. It's an irrelevant caption to how the game is played around the nation. And you kind of just hit on that. What has happened in the Power Five over the last number of years, of course, is realignment. We're still hearing about it now with potentially the Big 12 expanding or maybe not. You've gone through that within the Southern Conference. Of course, College of Charleston left, Elon left, Georgia Southern and App went together or left together. You've had Mercer come in, you've had Samford come in, VMI came back into the league. How's that changed the competitive dynamics of the SoCon over the last couple seasons?
Well, first of all, I want to talk about exactly what you said as far as the Power Five not existing in college baseball. And you and I have known each other a long time, and there's nothing more true that I've heard you say about that, and that is spot on. And what people do naturally is they just equate everything from football to every other college sport, because that's the one college sport people watch the most. So people just assume every other sport in quote-unquote Power Fives are as good as they are in football. And one example that we have down the road is Clint Dempsey, who's arguably, since Landon's retired, the most famous soccer player in America. He went to Furman. And that is not a Power 5 conference, yet he's one of the best soccer players in the world. And so when you get down to Olympic sports, baseball, soccer, tennis, the Power 5 isn't there. Now, they have probably more resources, more money, I would assume. But I can tell you right now, the best teams around here, Coastal Carolina being one, we touched on them. You know, Clemson and South Carolina are certainly part of it. But, I mean, Mercer just had the 11th pick overall coming out of a quote-unquote mid-major. So, you know, you just don't see that in any other sport besides baseball. And so I would agree with you wholeheartedly that Power 5 it just doesn't flow into our sport. Certainly has its place, but not in baseball as much as anything else. What we've done as far as what we've turned over in our league is, you know, it is certainly different because, you know, College of Charleston was the measuring stick. When John Pulowski was there and they were doing so well, and then Monty took over and they got rolling, you know, they were just so good, and that was the measuring stick. And they leave, Georgia Southern leaves, you know, all the schools you mentioned, but now it's just a new set of challenges. And what I think, a little mistakenly, and obviously I'm biased because we're in the Southern Conference, I don't think the change in landscape of our league has changed us to being a one big league. I think it's the change in the RPI, whereas now you get 1.3 for a road win, 0.7 for a home win. When you go back and you look at when the Southern Conference was getting 2-3 teams in a year because the RPI was different. And it's no coincidence that Bradley, Indiana State, and a lot of these northern teams are now taking at-large bids from Southern Conference, from the Big South, purely because of the RPI. And so to me, the conference is just as challenging, just as dangerous, but we've turned to a one big league because the RPI has shifted. And so now you sit there and, you know, Sanford's a measuring stick, Mercer's a measuring stick. You know, there's very good teams. I mean, VMI comes in last year, and I think they ended up finishing 4th their first year in the league when everybody thought, you know, they're a military school. They think they have some challenges, but they came in and had 2 guys drafted and were a very good team. And so it's changed, but I think the reality of the situation is it's just as challenging, but the RPI shift has turned the SoCon into a one-bid league, not the shift in teams.
There's been plenty of discussion around the RPI, mainly from West Coast head coaches this current season, and how it may be imbalanced for the way their schedules and competitive landscape fits compared to those of you in the South. But let's stick with kind of some rule changes. What do you think about the lower seam balls? What do your kids think about the lower seam balls? And what other on-field rule changes maybe need further discussion, or do you like for the sport right now?
Well, I would, as far as the low seam ball goes, I really like it. And I think our kids really like it. You know, I was in favor of the BB core. I was in favor of the low seam ball. And my main reason for being in favor of both of those were because it puts us on a more level playing field or makes us more similar to professional baseball. And anything we can do in college to make our sport more similar to professional baseball, I think is beneficial. So going to a minor league type ball, I think is good. We're never going to go to good wood bats. It's just not feasible. It's not cost effective. It's not cost efficient. So now taking the bats down and taking the life out of them, making them more similar, I'm all for it. And, you know, the on the field stuff is going to continue to evolve. It's going to continue to make its way through, and it's going to change with the game. But, you know, as far as the RPI goes, to me, I'm not opposed to a road win meaning more. I think it's a great concept. I just think 1.3 is too much. And I believe we got our model from basketball where the home team wins 67% of the time regardless of team. Well, I would venture to guess that the home team does not win 67% of baseball games regardless of competition. And I'd want to see how that stacked up. 1.1, 1.15 for a road win, that's about where I would think it should be. 1.3 I think is too steep.
Interesting. I'm going to have to do some research now to see if that 67% is right or not, because it's an interesting thought. Why does the sport of baseball lend itself well to high academic institutions having success? And of course, some of the easy places to point this out, it would be at Vanderbilt, historically at Stanford, historically for sure at Rice. Is that the same? Do the same advantages exist for a school like Wofford or a school like Elon or a school like Furman?
I think what's different for us is, when we go out recruiting and we go out to tournaments, either high schools or travel ball or wherever we go, the first thing we always ask those coaches are, okay, who are your high academic student athletes? And every conversation seems to start there. And what you find out happens, at least in our experience recruiting-wise, is you see a player that says, okay, I really want that education. I crave a high education. I want to be challenged in the classroom. I want my degree to mean something. And our football coach says it best, who's been as successful as anybody at the FCS level. You can go anywhere and get a degree, but you come to Wofford to get an education. And I think that rings true, and there's players out there who really crave that. The caveat with us is, at least at Wofford, you'd have to ask, those guys at Furman and Elon and Stanford. For us, it's, I really want a good education unless I get a shot to play in the ACC. And if they get a shot to play in the ACC or SEC, they're going to pretty much forego, or maybe not forego, a place like Wake or North Carolina, Virginia, of course. But if you really want that high academic education in a mid-major, or if I get a legitimate shot at playing in the ACC or SEC, I'm going to go ahead and take it. And everybody values things different, but people talk to us about the academics being a challenge. To me, it's either a disadvantage or an advantage, and we recruit and we sign a lot of players who crave that high academic campus setting as opposed to, one that maybe has a lesser ranking. So for us, we try to target those players and turn our education and what we provide our students into an advantage when we bring them in. And we want kids who crave that, and certainly we want families who crave that and who value the education as much as we do and as much as our professors do.
Recruiting dynamics is one of many interesting variables in the push by some head coaches out there to promote moving the playing season further into the summer. Additional exposure would be another. Potential revenue generation would be a third. Student athlete balance could be another in terms of how they spend their falls in that type of scenario. And let's be clear, this is, the conversation I had with Randy Mazey at West Virginia, that's where this series of conversations around the sport started, and we've got a number of more still to go. But I do want to ask, as a warm weather based, and certainly Spartanburg is not Coral Gables, but Spartanburg is obviously not, Manchester, New Hampshire either. So as a warm weather based head coach, how do you feel about these proponents of pushing the season further into the summer to achieve some of the things we talked about and also more competitive balance?
Well, the layers of this conversation are so deep, it's just almost impossible to hit every angle. So I'll try to kind of hit it from from our perspective, like you said, a school in South Carolina. I was in favor a long time ago of the uniform start date, and I think I was in the minority of Southern head coaches to go to the uniform start date. So in terms of parity, I like it, and in terms of exposure, I like it. However, one thing that we really impress upon our student athletes is we want to develop our individual athletes to the utmost. And it's what we talk about in recruiting. It's what we talk about in everything. We want to develop. We want to develop. We want to develop. If we have a player come in as what he was in high school, and we try to compete in our conference, it's just not going to work out. We have to make drastic improvements in our individual athletes in order to compete. Now, don't get me wrong. We signed some good high school players, no doubt about it. But we want to get them better. And summer ball is a huge place for development for us. And so one of the reservations I would have is by moving the college season into the summer, as far as student athlete experience, are you actually now asking them to play less games in a 12-month span? Because now you have, even a school like Wofford, we sent a handful of guys to the Cape. And we had 2 guys drafted this year, one in the 6th round, one in the 29th round, both seniors. They both pitched in the Cape last year. If we were to move our season into the summer, would those 2 players have forgone that opportunity and not gotten that exposure against the best competition in the country? So now, is that enhancing student-athlete experience, or is that taking away from student-athlete experience? So the other side of it is the cost. And, for instance, this year, we finished school a week earlier than we had in my previous 10 years here as assistant and head coach. The challenge of making that work financially once school was out was a bear. And while our housing is great, our director of housing is great, everybody lives on campus, they stay on campus. I mean, you're talking about feeding 35 athletes 3 times a day, 4 times a day for 2 straight weeks. I mean, it adds up. And now I understand the argument is, okay, well, we generate more revenue and that counterbalances it. I get all that. I get the argument. However, I say this all the time. This is not professional sports. This is amateur athletics. And I understand what football looks like, especially. And I understand what basketball looks like, especially. I like this being amateur athletics. I like the fact that there's a balance between education and athletics. I like the fact that we try to develop our student athletes to the utmost degree. I like the way it is. However, you said we're in a warm weather climate, and we are. I can tell you we're down there in the dugout in late February, and I've got as many layers on as we've issued, and we're trying to make it work. So a slight pushback I'd be okay with, moving it all the way into the summer and foregoing summer baseball, taking the fall off, spring is preparation. To me, I'm not really interested in that. And I like the way things are, and I think a gradual course of improvement for our sport is fantastic. But you look at the ratings college baseball has on ESPN in Omaha, the coverage of regionals. I mean, 6 years ago, they weren't even covering regionals. And now you can watch every single regional game on ESPN or ESPN3. So our sport is expanding, but is it not expanding fast enough for people? I think we're going at a great rate. I think our sport is expanding at a fantastic rate. And at the same time, I think we're keeping our integrity, and I think we're keeping the development of true student athletes more so than other sports.
And that's today's One Question, brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996. One Question is designed to give D1 Ticker subscribers valuable insights on how executive leaders in college athletics think about key issues on their respective campuses, in their departments, or within their leagues and conferences. One Question is brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996.